This is Jody Traversaro, and I just want to thank all of you for attending our Virtual Training Center webinar today, which is Nonverbal Communication, the Unspoken Message. While you're waiting, please mute your microphone or press Control-M. Also, to download a copy of today's presentation and any handouts, you can click on the handout icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, or press Alt-H, then press the down arrow to move through the selection and spacebar to select the handout. Tab to move to the menu and Enter to download. I am so proud to report that over 15,000 state employees have received training via the Virtual Training Center, so thank you for helping us make this successful. This is Jody Traversaro, and with Joan Strohauer, we oversee the statewide Learning and Performance Management Program. The Virtual Training Center is a product of a collaboration between several departments and agencies and amazing training managers statewide. Our presentation today is Nonverbal Communication, the Unspoken Message. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to some features of Microsoft Live Meeting that'll help this webinar be more interactive for all of us. If you look at the top right-hand corner of your screen, there are 4 buttons I want to call your attention to. You can either use your mouse or use your keyboard to download handouts, mute or unmute your microphone. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A button and typing your question in. And in addition, today we have real-time captioning to assist people with hearing disability. So this tool is ADA compliant, and let's see, some of the keyboard shortcuts are also on your screen. If you'd like to ask a question and not use the mouse, you can press Alt-Q and then press Control-Tab repeatedly until your cursor is in the box. Then you can type the question, and then you press Tab to ask, and you press Enter. In addition, you can turn the captioning on and off by pressing Alt-O. So again, welcome to the Virtual Training Center. I am so pleased to have Grant Lee, our Human Resources Director. And I'm sorry, Grant, looks like we put Lee Grant instead of Grant Lee on the presenter slide there. I am just thrilled to have Grant on the line today. He's the Human Resources Director of the California Public Utilities Commission. He's in San Francisco. So to show you the powerful the powerful tool that Live Meeting offers is we've got Grant in San Francisco. We have over 166 people logged in, and I believe we had about, I'm going to say 300 or 400 people registered, so more people are going to join us today, Grant. Grant joined the CPUC and began working for the state in 2010. Prior to that, Grant spent 16 years in the HR field in the private sector, working in the areas of compensation, human resources information systems, benefits, employee relations, training development, analytics, and process improvement. While there are many important training needs that exist, Grant decided to focus on the subject of communication because he sees that in most workplace conflict situations, miscommunication is generally the root cause. His goal for leading this webinar is to provide his colleagues in state service a better understanding of how nonverbal communication impacts communication in general, so we can improve relationships and hopefully minimize miscommunication and conflicts in our workplace. I want to remind you all that this webinar is being recorded, and Grant, I'm going to pull up your PowerPoint and have you begin the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jody, for the introduction. I'm really glad to be here today. We have a lot of great things to share with you, and hopefully the information that we share with you will be of extreme value. So the subject that we're going to be talking about today is nonverbal communication. Let's take a look at our objectives today. So the purpose is to introduce you to the various forms of nonverbal communication, to discuss the impact it has on everyday communication. And of course, the goal is to help you understand how to prevent and avoid misinterpretations of nonverbal communication, both as speakers and listeners, so that we can communicate more effectively. My other goal is that you're able to promote awareness of nonverbal communication with others who may not be able to attend today. So before we begin, we have a poll for you. And the poll is, in face-to-face communication settings, what percentage of communication do you think is interpreted and understood by the listener through words only? Is it greater than 75%? Is it between 51 and 75%? between 25 and 50%, or less than 25%. And I have special instructions here. If you are using your keyboard instead of a mouse, please press the Control tab repeatedly just until the speaker icon is not selected anymore. Then use the Tab key to select the answer. So if you could spend a moment to answer this question, I'd greatly appreciate it.
You know, Grant, when I think about nonverbal communication, I think of poker. You know,
there is a lot of nonverbal communication that goes on in poker, absolutely.
And what's interesting is sometimes as management, we have to represent things we disagree with when we communicate to our staff. So not only do we need to be, you know, aware, self-aware of the nonverbal communication we have as managers, you know, but we also need to read and be acutely aware of those nonverbal cues. So I can't wait to hear what you have to say today.
Jody, can we move on to the next slide while the poll is taking place?
Absolutely. So it looks like we have, actually, when I pull up the slide, the poll goes away. So I'll go ahead and do that. Are we ready to move on?
Yes.
Okay. What is the correct answer?
The correct answer is actually less than 25%, and we'll see what the exact number is in just a short while from now.
Wow. Thank you, Grant.
Okay, so let's take a look at the basic verbal communication process. I think that most people think of communication as a two-step process, right? The speaker speaks and the listener listens. It's actually a five-step process. Let's take a look at this model. Step one, the speaker formulates a message that she wants to communicate. And in step two, the speaker decides what choice of words to use and in what setting and how will I communicate this message. In step three, the message is transmitted to the listener with both words and nonverbal communication. In step four, the listener hears and sees what the speaker is saying and doing. And in step five, the listener decodes or interprets the words and nonverbal communication to arrive at the perceived meaning and understanding of the message. And along the way, there are breakpoints that can occur that result in miscommunication. And so we're going to talk about some of these breakpoints and the role that nonverbal communication has in creating confusion and misinterpretation. So what is the definition of nonverbal communication? Nonverbal communication is the unspoken communication that goes on in every encounter with another person, such as body posture, positioning, gesture of hands, arms, legs, and feet, facial expressions, and even the use of intonation, volume, touch, and proximity, as well as the use of color, objects, and space. Nonverbal signals are unconscious parts of our behavior that are rooted in our makeup and occurs with every encounter. And to untrained speakers, many nonverbal communication behaviors occur unknowingly. Unfortunately, there are times when words spoken don't always match up to the nonverbal behaviors, resulting in miscommunication. So it's important to understand the nonverbal behaviors in order to minimize the miscommunication. There are lots of studies done on the subject of nonverbal communication. I'd like to share with you one particular one, and it was one conducted by Albert Moravian, who's currently Chairman Emeritus of UCLA's Psychology Department. And he found that in his studies, only 7% of personal communication is carried through words. So that means an astounding 93% is carried through nonverbal communication means. So if we tie this back to our earlier poll, for those who answered, less than 25%, you're right on target, because a lot of communication and interpretation of communication really is carried through nonverbal communications, hence the importance of what we're talking about today. So we're going to talk about 5 types of nonverbal communication today: kinesic, paralanguage, proxemic, artifactual, and haptic. Kinesic communication occurs with body language. Paralanguage is communication through voice, tone, and speed of what we're saying. Proxemic communication is communication through space and distance. Artifactual communication is through visuals, colors, and haptic is touch. And we'll cover each of these in great detail. So first of all, let's talk about kinesic communication. Kinesics was originated by anthropologist Ray Birdwhistell in 1952. He studied how people communicate through posture, gesture, stance, and movement. He argued that all movements of the body have meaning, none are accidental, and that these nonverbal forms of language have a quote-unquote grammar that can be analyzed in terms of spoken language. So kinesics is the interpretation of body language such as gestures with hands, arms, and legs, facial expressions, and body posture. So let's examine gestures. Okay, Paul Ekman and Wallace Friesen identified 5 categories of gestures in 1969, and these are emblems, illustrators, effect displays, regulators, and adapters. So emblems are a direct replacement for words. For example, a traffic officer waving his hand to tell the traffic to stop or go, or a peace sign, or even the middle finger if we're upset at people, right? Illustrators shape what is being said. So people who are trying to explain a shape can use their fingers to do a square. Or I, as a basketball coach, sometimes I show my kids how to shoot. I'll show them an imaginary shooting form. You know, I'll shoot the ball in the air, an imaginary ball in the air, and that's to illustrate how to do something. Affect displays are shows of emotion, such as fist pumps, finger pointing, or hands crossed or open arms. Regulators control the flow of conversation, hand signals to tell somebody to slow down, for example. And adapters are self-oriented tension relievers. For example, rubbing their hands together, stretched arms out. These are all different forms of gestures. Think about the different gestures you might use or other people use on an everyday basis. You probably use all 5 types of gestures, and when used properly, gestures enhance and clarify communication, but when gestures don't match the words, it can confuse and frustrate the listener. So use gestures carefully. Next, let's talk about facial expressions. The face is an important source of information. Since the face can't be easily hidden, it's an important source of nonverbal information, and we communicate through emotions that we show with our face. So for example, head positioning and tilt. A speaker who looks down a lot can appear nervous, right? If a listener is turning their head away or looking down or up, that can signal disinterest or disagreement. And a person who nods conveys agreement and attention, while a head movement left to right means disagreement. Oculesics, the eyes. The way eyes are used during communication is described as oculesics. And the eyes really give away what a person is thinking or doing here. So the way a person looks at another person can signal feelings of anger, sadness, anxiety, fear, or guilt. If eyes are centered, it means they're focused. If they're gazing up, they're probably thinking. If they're looking down, it can signal shame. If they have wandering or shifty eyes, it can mean that they're dishonest. And I've seen situations where people roll their eyes when someone says something. That's not only rude, it's telling the speaker that they don't care. The eyebrows and forehead also provide signals. From surprise to fear to anger. One raised eyebrow can signal skepticism. Wrinkled forehead can signal anger. In addition, the mouth also provides signals. A smile signals warmth, agreement, and interest. Pursed lips signal anger. Let's now talk about body posture. We're going to talk about 2 different forms of body posture, and one has to do with arms and legs, whether they're open or closed. So open arm and legs versus and leaning forward and backward. So if a person's leaning forward and backward, these all mean something. John Moll is a consultant on communication and team building, and he's broken down body language using the open and close and the forward and back factors here. So if we take a look at this chart, leaning forward and backwards, that's planted on the x-axis, left and right. And the open and closed arms and legs positioning, that's planted on the y-axis, up and down. And he's formulated 4 different forms of body language here, 4 basic modes, as he calls it: responsive, reflective, combative, and fugitive. So let's start with responsive. So if someone is leaning forward and they have an open arm and leg position, it generally means that the listener is being responsive. they're eager, they're engaged. That's the best position for a speaker to see the listener in. And as a listener, that's the best position you can show the speaker. Reflective is also good. Reflective means that they're evaluating and attentive. It's a position where they're leaning back a little, so they're not leaning forward. They're leaning back, but they have an open body position. So that's a positive position too. Now let's look at combative. Combative is in a quadrant where the person is leaning forward, but their arms and legs are closed. That's a combative stance. Either they're in complete disagreement, or they're angry, aggressive, or they're lying. It's a negative position to be in. Fugitive is also not very good. So in a fugitive position, they're leaning back, and their hands and arms are crossed, and the legs are closed. It means rejection, or they're bored out of their minds. So as a speaker, you can take a look at the crowd in front of you and see what position they're in, and that'll signal maybe what you need to do to more properly engage your audience. Or as a listener, you have to be careful not to send a wrong signal to the speaker that you're disinterested or that you are angry with them.
You know, Grant, I also think of staff meetings.
Exactly. And if you observe in your next staff meeting the body positioning and whether their arms are open or closed, just observe, and you'll be surprised to see what people are doing in these meetings and their level of interest or agreement or disagreement. You'll see it manifest itself in the way that their body positioning is and whether they have an open or closed position. So here are tips for kinesic communication for speakers. Have good posture, be aware of facial expressions. Smiling is always good because when you smile, it gives a very positive feeling to the listener, and a lot of times the listener will reciprocate and let you know that everything's going great. Maintain sincere eye contact, that's important too, and use proper gestures to improve your speech. As listeners, don't end up in the responsive or reflective positions that we just talked about. That's sending the speaker a really bad signal. Uncross your arms or legs. There's actual research that shows people who uncross their arms and legs end up having higher retention, memory retention of the material. Head movement. Use nods if you agree, but don't put your head down or look away from the speaker. Maintain eye contact. Use facial expressions if you agree. Next, let's talk about paralanguage communication. So paralanguage communication is the way that we communicate through pitch, volume, and intonation of speech. This was introduced by George Traeger in 1958, and how we use our voice greatly influences the message. So here are some examples. I'll present 3 examples. The first one is called a bad morning. So pretend you're in an elevator and it's a Monday morning and you greet someone and say, "Good morning." And the person responds, "Morning." Are they really having a good morning? Or are they having a bad morning? You're not sure, right? You tell a subordinate or a colleague to help out with a project. Can you copy this deck for me? And they say, "Sure." Are they really sure? Are they positive? Do they really want to help you? Or are they basically telling you, "I don't want to do this, but I'll do it because I have to"? And then another example, the call for attention. A client approaches the service desk, doesn't see anyone. "Hello?" Are they being rude, or are they really just seeking service? So the way that we say something, the way that we say things in a way with a high pitch or how loud, that greatly influences the message that we're sending. And so as speakers, we need to be careful. We need to speak loudly and clearly, use pauses or silence, don't speak too fast, and break speech into breath groups so that the listener can clearly understand what we're saying. There's also research that says keeping your voice down helps you sound authoritative. And it goes to instances where some people, when they speak, they end sentences on a high pitch, almost as if they're uncertain or unconfident in what they're saying. They say avoid that. Keep your voice consistent, keep it down low. As listeners, you have every right to clarify if you're unsure about the message. So going back to the unsure about, sure, if I'm a manager and someone says something to me in a way where I'm not sure about what they meant, why not ask, oh, what did you mean by that? Just clarify. Avoid the misinterpretation. Don't formulate thoughts or try to figure out what people mean. Just ask. And as you can also ask the speaker to alter their volume or speed to ensure that you have a clear understanding. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, we're going to do poll number 2. Poll number 2. How close do you typically allow a colleague at work to stand in front of you during a conversation before you begin to feel uncomfortable? Is it less than 18 inches? Is it between 18 inches and 4 feet? Between 4 feet and 12 feet? Or greater than 12 feet? Hopefully not greater than 12 feet.
This is excellent, Grant. Thank you.
Okay. I think we've gotten a pretty good sample size here. Looks like the majority of folks are voting between 18 inches and 4 feet. Some are less than 18 inches. We have 10 people who say between 4 and 12 feet. What this is showing is that there's a varying degree of comfort level of distance. You know, we each have a proxemic. We're going to get to the next slide and talk about proxemics. But this is a very good example, cross-section of the varying degrees and interpretation of what is comfortable and not comfortable.
It sure is. Okay. So I'll pull up the next slide for you there, Grant.
Thank you. All right, so proxemic communication is communicating with others by virtue of the relative positioning of our bodies. This was introduced by anthropologist Edward T. Hall in 1966. He's a person who studied how we communicate through space. And he takes into account body spacing and postures as involuntary reactions. Okay, so proxemic communication is communicating with others by the relative positioning of our bodies. And we all have territorial markers. Typically, human beings stake out space or territory, and the territoriality describes the need to demonstrate a possessive or ownership relation to space. And we have markers. And these markers are used to reserve that space and set boundaries that help identify the space as to belonging to somebody. And usually people keep a social distance between themselves and the person to whom they speak, and each person has a varying degree of comfort as to what that distance is. So this is a chart that shows the proxemic distance ranges that Hall identified. These ranges are used to express the degree of intimacy and trust towards another person. The actual space parameters, as we saw in our poll, differs. And it differs because of personal, gender, cultural, religious, and other factors. So let's take a look at the 4 different types of proxemic distances. Okay, the first one is called intimate relationships. From 0 inches, that's right up in someone's face, right? From 0 to 18 inches, that's called an intimate relationship where, this distance is reserved for those most closest to us, our loved ones, children, spouses, partners. This is where you feel very comfortable allowing someone to get right up in close to you, in your face. Personal relationship. Personal relationship ranges from about 18 inches to about 4 feet. This is where we communicate with people who we know and are generally comfortable with. So not on an intimate level, but on a personal level. And from the poll, it looks like most people were fine with this personal distance right here. And this is the distance that we do most of our talking with our colleagues face to face. Some said that 18 inches was fine. And again, that could be culturally based. Different cultures are fine with, getting right up and being inches apart from someone's face. It's the right thing to do in their minds. And then for a lot of other people, the generally accepted distance is this 4 feet boundary. In general social relationships where we might not know the other person, in meetings with other people for the first time, for example, the general acceptable social distance is anywhere from 4 to 12 feet. And in public relationships, meetings, etc., it's 12 to 25 feet. So here are some tips for successful proxemic communication. There's a term coined proxemic invasion. So proxemic invasion is when we step into someone's boundaries and begin to make them feel uncomfortable. That's proxemic invasion. And as speakers, we want to avoid that. We don't want to make the listener uncomfortable. If we're making them uncomfortable, how are they going to listen to what we have to say? They're more busy worrying about their space being invaded and feeling uncomfortable, right? So we have to understand, what we just talked about, these general proxemic distances, and be sensitive to the fact that while these are general distances, each person has different tolerances, again, tied to individual and cultural differences. As speakers, we should be aware of their body language. Subtle hints that maybe they're leaning back or stepping away signals to you, you might want to back off a little bit. You're invading their space. As listeners, we should be careful. As listeners, we should also be careful that we don't make abrupt moves because the intention factor might not be that they want to invade your space or that they don't want to make you uncomfortable. They don't know. So give subtle hints. Take them a small step back. Make a small lean, but don't make abrupt jumps back as in, hey, get away from me. We don't want to send that message. So we also need to be sensitive to individual and cultural differences as listeners as well. Next, let's talk about artifactual communication. Take a look at the person in this picture, and what do you think he's telling you by the way that he's dressed, by the jewelry of choice, by the way he's got his hat tip? What is he saying? Is he saying, don't mess with me? Perhaps I'm tough. I've got an attitude. I'm Benjamin Button's brother. Artifactual communication is what's happening here. Without even saying a word, he's telling you something about himself. He's communicating to you. So artifactual communication is nonverbal verbal technique used to express themselves through color, objects, and space.
And we have a question that I'd like to ask you, Grant.
Yes.
Okay, we have a question that says body language. Have you heard of mirroring, and can you explain what this is? Thanks.
Yes, I have, and let me cover that at the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
That's a very good question. We'll cover that in the end. Okay, so artifactual communication, color, objects, and space. Now take a look at this guy. He's asking you, trust me to take care of your finances and return investments. Would you? Would you trust this man? Why not? Perhaps you were influenced by the color and pattern of the wallpaper in his office. Maybe the color of his suit or his tie. Maybe the way he styled his hair. Perhaps you're questioning, why the heck would this man be wearing sunglasses indoors? What is he about? If you said yes to any of these, then you were influenced by artifactual-based reasons. So individuals communicate with color, objects, and space. What color and type of clothes they wear, the jewelry and accessories, tell something about their attitudes and personalities. Also, how they decorate their workspace, or even how we decorate our home, how tidy or messy we are all forms of nonverbal communication. So think about the image and message we send as speakers about ourselves by the way we dress, and how our office or home space looks. And in corporate terms, think about the implications for professionalism and client service. And perhaps when we go interview, think about the impact that artifactual communication has in the way that we present ourselves. So tips for successful artifactual communication. We should match colors, objects, and space accordingly within the context of the situation. Consider the image that you want to project. Does it match? Consider workplace considerations. Again, going back to what I just talked about. I'm in charge of a human resource office, and what I would like to project as a human resources director is a professional client service perception. And so one of those is how we project ourselves, how we dress, how our office space looks. Think about when you go out to a restaurant. I had a person who once told me he judges a restaurant by how tidy and well-kept the restroom is. And if the restroom wasn't well-kept, they wouldn't want to go eat there. It speaks a lot by how we maintain our workspace and our office space. It means a lot. Check your personal appearance and the appearance of your space. Remove barriers. Sometimes we have physical obstructions that can get in the way, that block the view, such as at our desk. If we're in a client-facing situation, we might stack our trays high. Remove those. There was a senior executive who once indicated that he also could evaluate his team's comfort by how high they held their coffee cups. And it was his observation that the more insecure individuals felt, the higher they held their coffee, because they used a barrier to cover their insecurity. So this is all very interesting. Now we have another poll. Poll number 3. Is it acceptable for colleagues to hug each other, give pats on the back for encouragement, and have other forms of physical contact as long as it is quote-unquote professional? Wow, this is interesting. Sometimes we have a small number of nevers, and we have a few always. What we're going to be talking about in just a moment is another form of communication that has to do with touch. And again, this type of communication is rooted in individual culture, tolerance, and differences. And it looks like the majority of folks here say that sometimes it's acceptable, depending on probably the context of this situation. And I think we can move forward now. So the 5th type of nonverbal communication is called haptic communication. Haptics was identified by psychologist Richard Heslin, who studied the manners of touching in different societies. He found that touch is an extremely important sense for humans. For example, there's a difference between the words "I love you" versus a genuinely warm embrace. There's a huge difference. The meaning of touch varies highly depending on the person's culture, the context of the situation. The relationship is very important here. The relationship between communicators and also the manner of the touch. So touch provides a direct contact with other persons, and again, it varies greatly with purpose and setting. Here's a collage of different examples of haptic communication. Starting from the upper left-hand corner, working around clockwise. So we see a person touching another person on the shoulder or arm, and it looks like the person is comforting somebody. But it can also easily be misinterpreted as, inappropriate touch, a sexual advance by another person. What if this were a man touching a woman, for example? Hugs, we see hugs all the time, but a hug can also be interpreted as something other than just to express appreciation and congratulations. A handshake, a weak or firm handshake, can be interpreted by someone as ungenuine or as a show of respect or power. I've had situations where someone squeezed my hand so hard it almost hurt. And I thought, well, why did they do that? And I reflect back, and I think it was because they wanted to show me that they were in control. So there are different forms of haptic communication, but with all different forms, there are dangers for misinterpretation. I'd also like to talk to you about Richard Heslin's 5 categories that he identified of haptic communication. There's functional and professional haptic communication, and then there's social and polite, there's friendship and warmth, there's love and intimacy, and then there's sexual and arousal. So in this picture, we see this woman just holding this man's head like a melon and getting ready to kiss him. So she's got his hand on his face. She's probably got her other arm around his waist or body, and she's hugging him. And this could be very innocent. She could be congratulating him for something, but how easy could this be where this guy interprets something else other than, or maybe he feels violated. Maybe he has an aversion to touch. Maybe when he grew up as a child, his parents never hugged him, poor kid, right? And he never really warmed up to being hugged by anybody, and there's a colleague here, we assume it's a colleague, who's hugging him. At face level, you would think that this would fall under the category of either 1 or 2, but there could be certain circumstances where this person has told him, oh, I think you're cute, you're a very handsome boy, and here she's hugging him and kissing him. It could rise to the level of a 3 or a 4, hopefully not a 5. And so what I'm trying to say is that there are dangers, huge dangers with haptic communication. And the issue is the interpretation by the receiver of the touch. The intent of touch is not always exclusive and can evolve into, again, any of those categories that we talked about. From an HR and EEO perspective, since I come from HR, haptic communication or miscommunication creates the greatest risk management and legal implications for agencies. And so the best rule of thumb is really to refrain from touch unless you're sure it won't be misconstrued. So the majority of us agreed that, based on the situation, it's sometimes acceptable. Use careful judgment. Be very sure that the person you're touching understands, your intention, that you have a certain relationship with that person where they know you and you know them. For example, you wouldn't go hug somebody if you've only known them for 5 minutes. They might not know what your real intention is. Be careful. It's fraught with mines here. So let's talk about nonverbal communication hazards. We've covered the 5 different forms of nonverbal communication. Let's now turn our attention to communication hazards. So although nonverbal communication can be very revealing, it can also be easily misinterpreted because nonverbal messages can be ambiguous and have more than one meaning or no meaning at all. And interpreting nonverbal communication is really subjective. It may not be accurate of the intention of the speaker. And in addition, differences in culture related to proximity, touch, physical gestures can all lead to misinterpretations. So we have to be very, very careful about how we apply nonverbal communication, both as speakers and as listeners. Let's talk about cultural differences for a moment. Cultural differences, this is a very interesting topic. We could actually have a separate webinar just on the topic of cultural differences. There's so much to talk about with cultural differences. We'll just try to touch and skim the surface with how cultural differences come into play with nonverbal communication and miscommunication. So general appearance and dress, we all know that different cultures dress differently. We need to be careful not to formulate opinions and judgments based upon how people dress. In different cultures and religions, they might wear robes, they might wear headpieces. We have to refrain from formulating judgments, and what we wear to situations like meetings or in the workplace, we have to be careful of casting a positive and conducive image to what we're trying to do. For example, if a speaker is going to do a presentation on dress for success, you don't want to dress like that man with the cap and the gold chains. You want to dress professionally so that we don't confuse people, right? Posture, there's differences in cultural interpretations of posture. Slouching, hands in pockets. For example, I'll say this. Hands in pocket is disrespectful in Turkey. Sitting with legs crossed is offensive in Ghana. Showing soles of the feet is offensive in Thailand and Saudi Arabia. So posture plays a role with cultural differences. Gestures in different cultures, there's different tolerances for gestures. For example, in counting, in Germany, they use the thumb equals 1, and in Japan, they use number 5. They use all 5 digits. Facial expressions, different cultural interpretations also affect communication. For example, in many Asian cultures, they suppress facial expression as much as possible, whereas in Arabic and Latin cultures, they tend to exaggerate expressions and animate expressions. Eye contact and gaze, same thing in different cultures. Looking at someone straight in the eye can be rude. and can also mean that there's sexual interest. And in other cultures, looking away and not looking at someone in the eyes can mean that they're disinterested and being rude. Same thing with touch. Islamic Hindu, they don't touch with the left hand. It would be a social insult because the left hand is used for toilet functions, for example, and I didn't know this. So we have to be careful about that. And paralanguage, or vocalization, there are different cultures where they tend to speak louder than others. In some cultures, speaking loud would mean they're rude. And let's not even look at cross cultures. Let's look at a New Yorker and a Californian, right? The way that New Yorkers speak versus West Coast Californians speak. New Yorkers tend to be more loud. And so we have to understand how culture plays a role in communication. And so it's important that we understand who our audience is ahead of time, know whether or not cultural differences do exist, do our study, do our homework, understand who our audience is, what cultural difference might come into play, and don't fall into those pitfalls. So as a speaker, to avoid misinterpretation, we should be aware. Be aware of all your nonverbal communication tendencies and cues you give as a speaker. Now that you've learned them all, you should take notice of what body posture, hand motions and gestures, the type of eye contact that you tend to make, and address those and make sure that the nonverbal cues that you're sending match the words that you're saying. Again, know your audience ahead of time. Know what their needs are, know if any cultural barriers exist, and incorporate those cultural differences in the way that you communicate both with words and your nonverbal communication cues. Speak clearly. Research indicates that listeners tend to favor and absorb, since research indicates that listeners tend to favor and absorb nonverbal communication, having a dull, boring, and soft voice isn't going to help. So speak clearly. If only 7% of your words are going to be absorbed, make sure that you do a great job with how you speak. And as a listener, you have a role in the communication process too. So when nonverbal communication issues crop up, or if you think that they mean something, don't jump to conclusions. Understand that nonverbal communication is very much open to your own subjective interpretation. Try to empathize with the speaker and see things from the speaker's point of view, and don't be so quick to be argumentative or offended. Make subtle hints when reacting to present concerns. These are all things that we can do as an effective listener. And here's a really good golden rule. When in doubt, right, if there's ever a mixed signal between what the person is saying and what they're doing with nonverbal communication, the golden rule is stick with the words, stick with the 7%. Don't try to feed off of the nonverbal cues and try to use that as the primary communication or your interpretation of the communication. Stick with the words. Also consider the context of the communication and determine whether the nonverbal behaviors is really, the intent of the speaker. Do they really mean it by doing what they just did with their nonverbal behavior? Ask that question. And above all else, I said it earlier, I'll say it again. As a listener, clarify. It's as simply as asking a question. What did you mean by that? Could you clarify and explain to me further, what you just said and what you mean? If you clarify, and don't be afraid to ask clarifying questions, you'll easily resolve a lot of the misinterpretations that crop up from basic everyday communication. So let's take a look at summary and takeaways here. So we've covered the 5 different forms of nonverbal communication, and so we should understand the various forms of nonverbal communication and the role it has in the way that we communicate and the pitfalls it creates for our communication efforts. We should leverage these nonverbal communications to enhance our communication skills now that we know about them. We should continue to explore and learn about nonverbal communication because honestly, what we've covered today in this short 45-minute webinar is just the tip of the iceberg. There are decades and decades of research that has been done on this subject, and there's a whole lot more for you to learn about this subject. And I hope that you're able to take what we learned today and apply it to your everyday communication, whether at home or at work, but especially at work. Realize that a lot of the conflicts and misinterpretations that occur in the workplace arise because of miscommunication. And by now knowing, the different cues, the different nonverbal cues that play a role in that miscommunication, I hope that you're now able to reduce those situations where problems come up and are now hopefully more effective communicators. And if you found that this presentation today was helpful in helping you understand how to improve your communication, I encourage you to share this information with others. If there are other colleagues, if there are subordinates who are having problems with communication, and if nonverbal communication is one of the culprits, please share this with them. And so that about concludes this presentation, and welcome any questions at this point.
Well, Grant, I have a question for you. With the world becoming more virtual, just like this webinar, you can imagine the shift in perceptions or how we can read nonverbal communications. So what tips would you give to us for the virtual world?
Wow, that's a really good question. My presentation was focused more on the face-to-face, but you're exactly right. When we don't see each other and we're communicating virtually, we're not able to see each other's hand motions. We're not able to see each other's facial expressions. You're not able to see my gestures. You're not able to see my body posture. You don't know if I'm leaning back, if my arms are closed. You don't know. And so, when we're communicating with each other through the internet, what's very important is what we type to each other, and at least with you and I, Jody, we're able to talk to each other. So speaking is very important. We talked about Albert Moravian's rule, right? The 7% versus 93. Well, we can wipe the other 93% out of the equation because that doesn't apply. The emphasis is now purely on verbal and also written communication. So with verbal communication, again, we talked about how to effectively use volume, pitch, and tone to very clearly articulate what we're trying to say. We can supplement that with typing messages to each other. And when we type messages to each other, again, you can also control the tone of what you type. How you ask questions, it can be perceived as being very rude or professional. So think about how we communicate with written communication and a message that we're sending about who we are as the sender of that message and what the tone of the message is and what our intention is. There's miscommunication that goes on with that as well. Does that answer your question?
It does. That was fantastic.
Okay.
We still have several questions I'd like to ask. And going back to one of the first questions we had, which is, have you heard of mirroring, and can you explain that?
Yeah, so mirroring is a technique that individuals can use to provide feedback. It's basically a feedback loop where if I'm speaking to someone and someone is in front of me and they're watching me talk and using hand motions, and I'm nodding as I'm talking and explaining a concept, the listener can do something called mirroring and mirror what I'm doing. So if I'm using hand expressions and I'm speaking and I'm nodding my head and trying to explain something, the listener can reciprocate by doing similar. If I'm leaning forward, if I'm in a position where, as a speaker, I'm very engaged with the listener can reciprocate that and mirror, and what that projects is complete, complete attention and respect, and that they're just wired into what the speaker is, and it works both ways. So as a listener, mirroring is a great technique to let the speaker know that you're actively engaged.
That's excellent. Well, we also have, let's see, questions here. Any special tips we can use if we're interviewing? Sorry, Grant, hold on real quick. We've got some background noise here.
Okay.
I don't know, Grant, if you were moving around, if that was you, but can you repeat that answer?
Yes. Okay.
Oh, excellent.
What I was saying is that that's a very good question, and it's something that I actually wanted to talk about, but I chose not to. As we talked about earlier, I come from the private sector, and our interviewing process and selection process is very different than the state system, right? In the state, it's more of a objective, purely objective-based, standardized rating criteria based type of selection process. Now, what I'm about to say is more of what we do in the private sector, right? So interviewing is a very interesting subject because that's something that I did for many years. And there's studies that show an interviewer determines and makes a determination within the first 4 minutes of the interview whether they're going to hire someone or not. A lot of that is based upon the person's dress and their mannerisms. Okay, so if they show up to an interview and they're not dressed professionally, if they wear a loud red shirt and their hair is unkept, in addition, if they exhibit all the negative nonverbal communications that we talked about, if they slouch, if they don't speak clearly, if they ramble, if they speak so fast that the interviewer is wondering, what is this person saying? They're speaking too fast. I don't understand. If all these things come into play, they've sunk their ship, right? Even if the person is qualified, they would have sunk their ship. So in interview settings, it's very important to consider every single one of the nonverbal communications that we talked about today. It doesn't play as big of a role in the state hiring process because we're not supposed to include those factors as appearance and all that. But if you're going to apply to a job outside of the state or to a private company, by all means, factor all these into play, dress for the occasion, dress professionally, make sure you speak clearly, do all the things that we talked about earlier that represent positive nonverbal communication. Otherwise, it'll sink you.
Well, that's, I'm glad somebody asked this question. We're on both sides of the table. On one end, when we are interviewing candidates for jobs or for exams, I think we owe it to the candidate to have positive, open-minded gestures so we can elicit or create a culture, a comfortable culture for anybody interviewing for a state job. And by creating that comfortable environment, you will elicit the best out of that person that you can. And so I think the nonverbal communication is, like Grant has discussed, is on both sides of the table. When you're interviewing, create that positive environment through your nonverbal communications. And then if you're on the other side interviewing for a job, it makes sense to also, keep that very positive nonverbal communication going. And I think in my email announcing this, I said, keep your eyebrows up, smile with your eyes, and talk, in a tone of voice that is like Grant says, is mumbling, it's clear. So I hope that's helpful. So here we have let's see, another question about mirroring. Does mirroring express empathy?
Absolutely. Mirroring absolutely exemplifies empathy, because if you're listening along as somebody speaking to you and you're listening along, and the speaker is telling you about something maybe sad, and their body language tells you that they're sad. And if you're a speaker, if you're the listener and you're empathizing and, you're nodding your head and, you're using hand gestures in some way, shape, or form, you touch your chest or your heart, or if you're expressing, sadness, if they're talking about a subject that's scary, a tragic accident or something, and you put your hands up to your face, and in amazement you put both of your hands on each of your cheeks, and your mouth is shaped like a big O because you're like, oh my gosh, you're letting the other person know that you are understanding what they're feeling. So absolutely, mirroring is is huge. I wish I added a slide on this, so I'm glad that people are bringing this up. Mirroring is huge and is a very positive feedback mechanism to let the speaker know that you're actively engaged and you understand where they're coming from.
Okay, we have a question here. I encounter employees who look out of the corner of their eyes. It's rather than an acknowledging glance.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think there's a mic that I need to mute there. I encounter employees who look out of the corner of their eyes rather than an acknowledging glance. What can that indicate?
Boy, that can indicate a lot of things. It can mean that they disagree with something or they're skeptical. It can mean that there's an ant at the corner of there's an ant on the floor that they're looking at. We don't really know unless they do it over and over again. Again, going back to the other suggestions, if this is a concern, if how this person shifts their eyes or uses body language to somehow signal recurringly that they're either in disagreement, I would say approach the individual and just ask, nonchalantly, hey, what did you think about what we talked about today? What do you think? And get it out of them. If you think that that listener has skepticism, disagrees, is disinterested, doesn't care, and you want to find out, the best solution is to go to the source and ask them. And you don't have to confront them. You don't have to say, you were looking the other way. Why'd you do that? Don't do that. Just ask them, well, what did you think? And get it out of them that way in a nonchalant way.
Okay, we have another question here. That was excellent. Thank you, Grant. Have verbal judo, the ability to disarm a person. You there?
I am.
Sorry about that. Have you heard of verbal judo, the ability to disarm a person who has become confrontational?
I've heard about that, and I haven't studied that, so I can't really speak to that, but it sounds very interesting. I know that in everyday situations, there's opportunities that we run into difficult people, and I think that's probably a good webinar in itself for how to deal with conflict and difficult people and how to communicate. I can't really speak to that. I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar with it.
So there are people complaining about some mic noise, so I'm sorry. I think it's just a very sensitive mic. But we have a question here. Does mirroring, excuse me real quick. One more mirroring question. It says, keep your voice down to sound authoritative. Does that mean low pitch or tone? Could you elaborate further?
Well, I think what that means is not to let your pitch rise high. I don't think there's a standard tone in order to sound authoritative. I think how we speak is we're individual. We each have our own voices. We each have our own pitch and tone levels. I think the key to that message was don't let it rise high as we end the sentence. Because when the pitch starts rising, what it signals is that we're really unsure of what we're saying. We're really unsure and lack confidence in what we're saying. It's almost like asking a question, taking a statement that we're trying to tell somebody about, and turning that into kind of like a question, like, I'm not too sure about this, what do you think? And so when we're in front of people and we're trying to teach people or give them information, you don't want them to think, you don't want the listener to think that you're unsure of what you're talking about. You want them to understand that you know what you're talking about and you're authoritative. Again, there's no standard pitch or tone, and there's not a meter that we could whip out and say, oh, the 3.5 level is the ideal. There's nothing like that exists.
Well, I'm going to just give one more question to you, Grant, and then I think this will lead you right into your next couple slides. What book would you recommend for learning more about differences in cultural customs versus professional cultural communications?
Well, You know, I haven't listed one specifically on, cultural differences, but I did look on Amazon. I didn't get a chance to get any of them or purchase any of them, but there are lots of great books out there. I would just suggest Googling, checking the Amazon ratings, and finding a book that's good for cultural differences, communication, and workplace. Using those three key words, look for the book that perhaps has the highest ratings and find that book there. That is a really, really interesting topic. Like I said, you could probably dedicate an entire webinar or two on cultural differences and how those cultural differences come into play, not only with communication, but with workplace dynamics too. There are conflicts that do arise, misinterpretations, and it also ties back into, diversity training that I think a lot of organizations here in the state of California either do or don't do, and that's really important.
It is so very important with our amazingly diverse workforce. And with that, I just want to thank you, Grant. Our time is up, and I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. Here is Grant's information, and of course, Joan and I are always available. If you have additional questions, please feel free to email those to us, and we will forward those on to our presenter if you don't capture his email address during this webinar. And again, we also have these leadership competency development guides on our website, which provide the state workforce with just tons of free resources that are available through the state library. So every state employee has access to ebooks and academic journals and periodicals. And if you go into the DPA website and you click on training and then leadership, you will find a whole host of resources by soft skill, and particularly you may find something in the interpersonal communications and also the fostering diversity. So with that, I want to thank everybody again for attending. Grant, thank you so very much. That was an incredible webinar. This webinar is now over.